The photograph arrived at the county archive inside a weathered envelope, brittle at the edges and yellowed from decades of neglect. Its paper fibers so fragile that even a gentle touch released thin dust into the air, dust that had perhaps once been part of a forgotten attic, an old drawer, or a cedar trunk where grief-laden memories were tucked away. When the archivist first slid the portrait free, it seemed at first glance to be entirely unremarkable, a simple studio image of two brothers posing side by side, dressed in threadbare coats that had been carefully brushed to look presentable, their boots cleaned but still bearing the faint outline of dried mud from the long walk into town. The photograph, likely taken sometime in the 1800s or very early 1900s, carried the aesthetic hallmarks of the era. A neutral backdrop painted with soft strokes meant to mimic a pastoral landscape, an evenly lit composition, characteristic of traveling photographers who set up temporary studios in rural towns, and two young boys standing rigidly in a posture taught to them moments before the lens opened. The older brother's shoulders were squared with a seriousness beyond his years, the corners of his mouth pulled into the faintest attempt at maturity, as if he understood that photographs were rare and important, and he did not want to disappoint whoever had saved up the money to have this one taken. The younger brother leaned slightly into his sibling, his expression softer, yet tinged with a nervous tension, the kind a child cannot hide even when told to stand still and look forward. To the untrained eye, the portrait was nothing more than a visual echo of countless rural American families from that time. Simple, somber, and sincere. But as any historian will tell you, some photographs whispered their truths slowly, and others, like this one, hide their secrets behind the smallest, almost invisible details. It took nearly 3 weeks before the archivists discovered why this seemingly ordinary portrait would become one of the most unsettling images they had ever handled, and why every person who studied it eventually found themselves returning to one specific part of the photograph: the boy's hands. It was Margaret Dean, a retired teacher who had volunteered at the archive for nearly 8 years, who first sensed something was off. She had cataloged thousands of photographs, and she possessed an uncanny instinct, an ability to feel when an image contained a story that hadn't yet been told. The moment she laid the portrait under the soft museum lamp, that instinct tightened in her chest. At first, she couldn't articulate the problem. The boys' faces were ordinary. Their clothes were consistent with the period. The backdrop was typical. But there was something else, something subtle, something the subconscious noticed before the conscious mind could form the thought. She leaned closer. That was when she saw it. The older brother's right hand, resting on the younger boy's shoulder, did not look like a child's hand. It was too large, too tense, the skin tone slightly mismatched compared to his face, as if the hand had been retouched or darkened. The angle of the fingers was oddly rigid, forced, pressing deeper into the fabric of the younger boy's coat than any relaxed hand should. And beneath that grip, barely visible at first glance, was a faint, uneven darkening on the younger boy's shoulder. When Margaret adjusted the lamp, the truth sharpened. It wasn't a shadow. It was bruising. Clear, deliberate bruising that seemed to match the exact shape of a human hand pressing down with far more force than the gentle pose implied. The younger brother's own hands were even more disturbing. His left hand hung at his side unnaturally, the fingers bent inward in a stiff, claw-like formation that lacked the softness and flexibility of a living child's posture. And the strangest thing? His rigid hand cast no shadow, not on his coat, not on the backdrop, not anywhere. Margaret had seen thousands of old photographs affected by exposure issues, motion blur, and chemical degradation, but she had never seen a hand simply erase its own shadow. She called the museum director, who initially dismissed her concerns as a photographic flaw, but the archivists who later examined the image realized that certain traits could not be explained by age or exposure alone. Someone had altered the photograph. The question was, why? To find answers, the team began researching the history of early portrait practices. At that time, photography was expensive and rare, and families often saved for years to afford a single image. One particular custom, rare today but common then, cast a darker cloud over the portrait: post-mortem photography. When a child died, especially in rural communities where disease swept quickly and harshly, the family sometimes arranged one final portrait. Photographers would pose the deceased child to appear alive, propping them upright, arranging their clothes, even painting eyes on the closed eyelids or retouching stiff limbs to soften their appearance. It was a way to create the only visual memory a family would ever possess. When the archivists considered this context, the unnatural position of the younger brother's hand, the mismatched shadows, the stiffness in his posture, and the subtle retouching near his wrist took on a chilling new meaning. It was possible, perhaps even likely, that the younger boy had not been alive when the photograph was taken. To confirm this, the archivists began hunting through local census records, church logs, and archive burials. They found a family in a nearby rural township whose sons matched the ages of the boys in the photograph: Samuel, 14, and Thomas, 9. The records revealed something devastating. Thomas had died the year the photograph was supposedly taken. The cause of death was listed as the fever, a vague term used at the time for illnesses ranging from scarlet fever to diphtheria. But if Thomas was dead that year, how was he standing in this photograph? The archivists gained access to more documents, piecing together details the way investigators assemble fragments of a crime scene. They found an old ledger kept by a traveling photographer who passed through the town around that same year. Among the entries was a chilling note: family of 2 boys, younger one difficult to pose, father insisted. Another entry, even more disturbing, read, retouch hand, smooth discoloration. This phrasing matched the exact type of retouching visible on Thomas's stiff fingers, which had clearly been altered to conceal something. Perhaps discoloration from illness, perhaps darker bruising, perhaps post-mortem rigidity that would have been disturbing to leave visible. But the story grew stranger still. When the portrait was scanned at high resolution and digitally magnified, archivists discovered something that caused even the most experienced historians to fall into a tense silence. Beneath the older brother's right hand, hidden under layers of retouching, was the faint outline of another hand, larger, adult-sized, positioned almost as if someone standing just outside the frame had been holding the younger boy in place. Portrait studios often used such support techniques to steady small children during long exposures, but in post-mortem photography, the adult holding the body was often a grieving parent, physically supporting the child so the photograph could present a peaceful tableau of siblings together. If that was the case, then the hand in the image was not the older brother's at all. It was likely the father's or the photographer's, positioned to hold the younger boy upright. The surface retouching had attempted to hide this detail, but time had softened the pigments, allowing the buried outline to re-emerge faintly. But even that explanation wasn't enough to satisfy the archivists, because there was one detail, one chilling, physics-defying detail that no post-mortem explanation could fully account for. Thomas's right hand, the one resting unnaturally against his thigh, showed motion blur. Slight, but undeniable. A dead child cannot move his hand. Someone had shifted it mid-exposure in an attempt to make it look more natural. But if someone moved it, who was it? And why was the movement so subtle, so faint, that it almost seemed accidental?
As historians delved further, they uncovered rumors, small, fragmented accounts recorded by neighbors that hinted at a different possibility. A letter from a nearby farmer referenced a terrible accident with the reaper machine that happened on the family's land that same season. But no death was reported from the accident, only an injury to the younger boy. If Thomas had been maimed, if he had suffered an injury too gruesome for the family to memorialize in a portrait. The photographer might have been asked to hide the disfigurement, retouch the fingers, and smooth over any visible trauma. This would explain the strange angles, the rigid posture, the retouched knuckles, the mismatched shading, but it did not account for the erased shadow, or for the second hand, or for the bruising shaped like a handprint on his shoulder. Unless the injury wasn't the cause of death, unless someone had grabbed him violently enough to bruise right before he died. One final clue came from the back of the photograph, where faint handwriting, nearly erased by time, spelled 5 devastating words: Samuel and Thomas, our last picture. Written by a parent, filled with the type of grief that cannot be disguised. But there is an even stranger truth buried within this image, a truth the archivists only realized when they increased the contrast so intensely that the photograph appeared almost inverted. When they did, they saw something hiding between the brothers, a shape, a faint outline, a third figure, faint as a ghost, standing behind them, a figure whose hand seems to align perfectly with the bruising on Thomas's shoulder. And that is where the real mystery begins. What happened next in the investigation changed everything, because as I dug deeper into the brothers' story, I realized that the unsettling detail in their hands wasn't just an oddity, it was the thread that pulled apart an entire century of buried truth. What first appeared to be a simple family photograph from a quiet rural town became the center of a forgotten scandal no one wanted to remember. The more I researched, the more I found people who grew strangely uncomfortable when I mentioned the boys' names, as if even discussing the past risked waking something old and heavy. Local archivists hesitated before pulling out records, and elderly residents who had lived in the area for decades would give stiff, curt answers, always avoiding direct eye contact, always changing the subject as soon as they could. Something about that photograph, the posture, the way their hands were positioned, the unnatural tension in the younger brother's fingers, seemed to haunt them, and I began to understand why. The truth was more disturbing than a misprint, more urgent than a superstition, and more tragic than a simple family mystery. I finally located a distant descendant, an older woman named Mrs. Alden, who agreed to speak with me as long as it was off the record. She invited me to her home on the outskirts of town, a house that felt older than the street it stood on, its walls filled with framed photographs watching everything silently. When she finally sat down across from me, she exhaled slowly, as though bracing herself before saying a name she wished she could forget. She told me the brothers were named Elias and Peter Wheatcomb, and that the reason their photograph had survived while almost every other record of the family had vanished was because this one image had followed them like an omen. "You saw their hands, didn't you?" she asked, and her voice was neither surprised nor curious. It was resigned, like she already knew the answer. I nodded, and that was enough for her to begin. She told me that according to family stories, the brothers had been inseparable as children, but not in the usual sense. They weren't just close, they were bound by something beyond normal sibling affection. The older brother, Elias, had always been protective, gentle, calm, the type of child who seemed older than his years. But Peter, the younger one, was different. He was bright, curious, but troubled by night terrors that began around the age of 6. These weren't ordinary nightmares. They were episodes so violent that neighbors could hear him screaming through the walls. During these episodes, his hands would seize into rigid shapes, curling inward unnaturally as if he were trying to grasp something that wasn't there. Physicians from surrounding towns examined him but found nothing physically wrong. Some believed it was stress, others thought it was spiritual. His mother kept a journal documenting everything, and in it she wrote that sometimes she would wake in the middle of the night to find little Peter not in bed, but standing motionless beside Elias, staring down at him with those tightly curled hands, the same hands recreated perfectly in the photograph years later. When I pressed Mrs. Alden on what the family thought caused these episodes, she hesitated, lowering her gaze. Then, in a shaky voice, she revealed something that made my skin crawl. The boy's father had died under strange circumstances shortly before the episodes began. No one in the town ever agreed on what happened. only that his body was found near the river with his hands contorted in the same unnatural shape Peter would later mimic. The official cause of death was exposure, but residents whispered darker explanations behind closed doors. That he saw something near the river he shouldn't have, that he touched something buried beneath its surface, or that he had fallen victim to an old superstition about the woods that bordered the water. The Weetacombe family had always been quiet, religious, and private, and after the father's death they became even more withdrawn. They rarely left the house except for church, and even then, people noted that young Peter kept his hands folded in a strange, rigid way, as if forcing them into compliance. The photograph was taken during this period, commissioned by their mother in an attempt to preserve at least one memory of their sons before everything spiraled out of control. She wanted a moment of peace, a still frame of her children before the shadows in their life grew too heavy. But instead of capturing innocence, the image froze their tragedy in time. As I listened to Mrs. Alden, she led me to a small wooden chest that she said belonged to Elias. Inside were letters he wrote as an adult, years after the photograph, letters filled with careful handwriting but deeply unsettling content. Elias described how Peter's episodes worsened as he grew older, how he would wake up with scratches on his arms and dirt under his nails, unable to explain where he'd been or what he had done. He wrote about the fear of waking up to find Peter standing beside his bed again, hands curled inward, lips moving silently in the dark. But what shook me most was one line near the end of a letter written when Elias was 16. He described a night when he followed Peter during one of his unexplained sleepwalking episodes. Elias wrote that he watched Peter move out of the house, across the yard, and toward the same river where his father had died. He kept calling out to him, but Peter didn't respond. When he reached him, Peter was crouched by the water's edge, his hands submerged in the freezing river, fingers curled so tightly they looked broken. Elias tried to pull his hands from the water, but Peter resisted with strength far beyond what a child his age should have had. When he finally managed to pull Peter's hands from the water, Elias saw that Peter was clutching something. A small, smooth stone, carved with symbols he didn't recognize. The next morning, Peter had no memory of the night before, but the stone remained in his possession, and according to the letters, the nightmares increased tenfold from that day forward.
I asked Mrs. Alden what happened to Peter later in life, and that was when her voice cracked. She said that Peter disappeared at the age of 19. Some said he ran away. Others whispered that he returned to the river one night and simply never came back. The official statement from the family was that he had left to seek treatment, but no records of any such treatment exist. After Peter's disappearance, Elias destroyed the stone, burned the remnants of it, and refused to speak about his brother for the rest of his life. Every photograph of Peter was removed from the house, except the one. That single portrait, the one with the unnaturally tense hands, the one that had circulated through antique shops and private collections, was the only remaining visual evidence of Peter's existence. When I asked Mrs. Alden why that photograph survived when all others had been destroyed, she confessed that the family tried to burn it multiple times, but it never caught fire. The edges singed, curled, and blackened, but the image itself would not fade. Even the curator who later displayed it in a historical exhibit said that the back of the photograph felt unnaturally warm when handled, as if it were resisting decay. As she finished speaking, I sat in silence, absorbing every detail. The story was far darker than I had anticipated, and the photograph suddenly carried a weight I hadn't felt before. I asked to see it once more, and as she handed it to me, I noticed something I had completely overlooked, something impossibly subtle but unmistakable now that I knew the truth. The older brother, Elias, wasn't simply placing a hand on Peter's back, he was gripping his shirt tightly, knuckles pale even in the faded tones of the print. It wasn't a comforting gesture, it was restraint. Even in the stillness of that staged portrait, Elias was holding on to Peter as though he feared what might happen if he let go. And Peter's hands, now that I understood the family's history, the tension in his fingers took on a horrifying clarity. They weren't posed, they weren't accidental. They were the exact contortion described in the father's death, the nightmares, the sleepwalking, and the night by the river. His hands weren't holding anything, but they were shaped as if something invisible rested there, something he once pulled from the river that forever tied itself to him.
As I left Mrs. Alden's home, the wind outside felt colder than it should have, and for a moment I wondered if this century-old tragedy still lingered in the quiet corners of the town. The photograph remained in my hands longer than I intended, and when I passed it to her one last time, I swear the paper felt warmer than before, as if holding a faint memory of the one who once stood behind the camera, eternally frozen with those unnatural hands. And that was when I understood the truth. This wasn't a story about a family, or grief, or superstition. It was a story about a moment captured at exactly the wrong time, the moment before a life unraveled, the moment before something ancient and unseen tightened its hold on a boy who never escaped it. And anyone who looks closely at the brothers' hands can feel it too, the echo of a past that refuses to stay buried.